I recently watched The Return of the King from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and spoiler alert, at the end of the movie, after Sam and Frodo have finally destroyed the One Ring in the fiery chasm, they are rescued by the large eagles away from Mount Doom. Now, I'm not the first person to have this thought. It is an ongoing debate about this major plot hole. Why did the Fellowship not simply send the rings with the large eagles to fly straight to Mount Doom and drop it off? Think of all the suffering that could have been saved. Think of all the deaths that needlessly occurred. Think about all of the harm and pain and evil that was allowed to persist during this entire journey. So, what's the answer? Well, if it happened that way, we wouldn't have a story. And this seems to be the same line of thinking around why doesn't God just destroy Satan? When Satan first rebelled, as the story goes, why did God not just end his life? Why did God not put him in some hell so far away from human involvement? Surely with God's foreknowledge, he knew everything that would happen, all the pain, suffering, harm, and death that would occur if Satan was not only allowed to live, but to thrive, to be given dominion over our world, to have access to our very thoughts and heart, to be able to deceive us and confuse us, to lie to us, to possess us even. And by his very existence, more people would die and stay dead or burn eternally in hell forever. So if we have a good God, how do we account for this enemy? And specifically for the allowance of this enemy, despite God's power and knowledge? That's the question I want to talk about today. And it's not as deep as you would think. There's not that far you can go with it. The way that I have decided to structure this video is two parts. In part one, we're going to establish the role of Satan. I want to do this biblically so that we can clear things up, because Satan is a mess in the Bible, at least if you take the entire Bible as a univocal story of sorts. So part one will be trying to establish that. And then part two, I just want to look at God's inaction. And I want to cover the excuses that apologists give for this and see if they really hold up. So I hope you'll follow me along today. This is a thought that I know most people have had at some time in their life. So let's give it as much attention as we can here. And again, the first thing I want to do is talk about the evolution of Satan. This is something that could get its own series. The origins of Satan, the mythology of Satan, what Satan becomes from where he starts, is an incredible thing to understand and to talk about. And I'm going to give you just the briefest version of it today. So in the Old Testament, we have the Satan, the accuser, an angel of the Lord, part of God's very counsel. The first place that we could possibly see Satan is in Genesis 3, but this is just the serpent. And it isn't until much later, and because of some verses in Revelation, that Christians associated the serpent with Satan or Lucifer or the devil or whatever name we want to be talking about. But the Genesis account is just that of a crafty serpent, a talking animal that had a level of knowledge about the way things were. We see no lie from this serpent. We see the lie actually on behalf of God. God says they will surely die if they eat. They do not surely die, maybe a spiritual death. We could talk about that in a different video as well. But all the serpent warns them of is that God doesn't mean that. You won't die. You'll have knowledge like him that he doesn't want you to have. And this is biblically accurate. Even if we went with the serpent being Satan, it doesn't really depict Satan the way that we think of him, at least from a New Testament perspective anyways. But again, this isn't to deconstruct the Genesis 3 story, so we'll leave it alone. But this is the first place we could see what some Christians will consider to be the influence of the devil in the Old Testament. Now, the next real place that we see the Satan is in Job. We see him a few times, and he is here a part of the heavenly council. He is able to have access to God's throne room. He is having conversations back and forth, bringing ideas, bargaining and negotiating with God himself. And only via God's allowance does Satan do anything that he does. And guaranteed, this is the worst that we get of Satan. He goes and kills Job's children or has them killed. And these deaths are about the only ones we can actually attribute to this horrible creature of pure evil. Meanwhile, we can put millions on God, just biblically speaking, but I digress. Again, here, Satan looks like an agent of the Lord. And in fact, throughout all of the Old Testament, we only see Satan as an agent of the Lord. In 1 Chronicles 21:1, we see the Satan, the accuser, incite David into taking a census that he is not supposed to take. The result of which makes God so angry that after this ridiculous genie-like deal through the prophet, David is awarded 3 options for what the punishment will be. And he chooses the one that affects himself the least, but ends up killing 70,000 of his soldiers. Now, interesting enough, there's a direct contradiction with 2 Samuel 24:1, where it says God incites David to take the census. So look up these 2 verses if you've never done it. This is the most obvious contradiction, I think, in the Old Testament, because it is comparing God himself with Satan, who Christians recognize as the very embodiment of evil, each of them telling David or inciting David to do this census. Now, there's no good way to explain this contradiction, but there is one way that makes it a little less bad, and it is to say, God was the one still inciting David, but he used his agent, the accuser, Satan, in the 1 Chronicles version. So see, it was God both times, which would lead to a whole nother issue where God is the one inciting David to do this thing and then punishes him for doing it, especially to the tune of 70,000 people that had nothing to do with this in the first place. However you want to defend it, those 2 verses make God either completely hypocritical, completely evil, or the Bible completely untrustworthy. But going with the very best version of those verses, again, we see Satan doing only what God has told him to do, even if it is evil, even if it will be punished. But the last one that I'll give you today from the Old Testament is Zechariah 3:1-2, I believe, where we have Satan accusing the high priest Joshua. Now here, God does not agree with Satan. In fact, he rebukes Satan for this accusation of Joshua. And so we see, again, Satan under God's thumb. He is able to bring an accusation against someone. He's able to say, hey, here's the issue. But in this case, God, for whatever reason, says, no, I rebuke you, you're wrong. Would have been nice if he did that for Job, because again, we know Job was perfect. He was righteous before God. So, long story short, Satan in the Old Testament is a sole individual, not a demonic horde. He is an agent of the Lord who performs a certain task as almost some prosecuting attorney for individuals before the Lord. Keep in mind, throughout the course of the Old Testament, we don't even see one demonic possession. We do see the Spirit of the Lord, an evil spirit of the Lord, even fall onto certain people. But this is from God, God causing confusion, God hardening a heart, God sending a lying spirit. By the time Jesus arrives on the scene in the New Testament, we have demonic possession everywhere and all of these demons that are running around in legions and hordes that need to be exorcised. And you would think, oh no, this is still Judaism, except it's not. This is a Greco-Roman influence, and it really gets developed via the New Testament. And we can see the evolution of the devil and his powers in a few of these verses. I'll just give you like 5. In Matthew 4:1-11, Satan is tempting Jesus while Jesus is in the wilderness fasting for 40 days. Now, this is very different. We don't see Satan going before God the Father getting permission to go tempt Jesus. We see Satan and Jesus, the 2 figures, the main entities, the spiritual yin and yang, fighting it out in the wilderness. Satan now becomes the embodiment of evil, the one trying to take down the Christ himself. This is something we could have never imagined to see in the Old Testament or prophecies about the Messiah. In John 12:31, we see another evolution where Satan becomes the ruler of the world. In 2 Corinthians 4:4, it jumps up another notch, the God of this world, or the God of this age, as it is sometimes referred, Satan, causing blindness and confusion in unbelievers. It says, so that they cannot see the light of the gospel. Again, so much for free will, but we'll get to that in part 2. Also, 1 Peter 5:8, Satan is not some passive entity just shown up when God decides to include him. No, Satan here is shown as a roaring lion on the prowl, on the hunt, looking for those he can destroy. And then some may argue here, but Revelation 12:9 is where we really tie it all the way back to the serpent, the great dragon, the deceiver, who is called the devil, who is called Satan. He was thrown down to the earth with his angels, thus giving Satan the power needed for this great deception over all the world with all his dominion on the physical and even spiritual properties of the earth itself. The main point I want to make before moving on to part 2 is we have a Satan that, because of his mere existence, let alone the power given to him, there are people that have been born, are born, and will be born that, according to the Bible itself, will burn in hell forever because of the existence of this being. That if he wasn't here, they wouldn't be blinded, they wouldn't be confused, they wouldn't be deceived, and they would otherwise be with God for eternity. So this goes a little bit back to my will to save discrepancy, where we have many verses saying God and Jesus desire that none should be lost. You mix that with the power of prayer, where if we pray sincerely and in faith in groups of 2 or 3 for God's will to be done, he will answer. And yet if God's will is for those to be saved and those prayers are happening and we're still not saved, we have a major issue. But a piece of that puzzle is the fact that we have an enemy making things worse, an enemy taking away free will, an enemy that if he had just been destroyed, every single thing about the existence of humanity would be better. And yet we have a God that has not taken action. So let us move on to part 2, the inaction of God. I think the first thing I'd like to do here is return to the Bible and just show in a few verses that God's inaction when it comes to this other agent is nothing new. Again, returning to Job, I think is the easiest thing. And if you want more here, just go watch my Job video from my secular Bible study series. I cover a lot of these same points, but we have Satan asking to do something. And yeah, God sets some limits. What were the limits God set with Job? He just couldn't kill Job. Anything else was fair game, even to the tune of dead children. And not only did God endorse and condone this behavior from Satan himself, he stayed out of it. He kept his hands clean. He boasted about his power. He boasted about his knowledge. And yet he did nothing with that power and knowledge to know what would happen and to stop it from happening, to, protect the innocent life. Remember how Christians always talk about how every single soul God has a plan for, the inherent dignity and value of each human being. Well, those children definitely seem like pure collateral to God, not to mention all of the workers that were killed who worked for Job. This is a God of inaction while Satan goes on destroying. In Luke 22:31 through 32, there's a really interesting occurrence that happens. Apparently, Jesus and Satan were talking at some unspecified time, and Satan told Jesus of his plans to sift Peter like wheat. He says, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded to have you." Now, many scholars interpret this as to test Peter. And do you know what Jesus did? He didn't stop Satan from doing it. He said, "I'll pray for you." He gave us the very first Christian, I'll send thoughts and prayers instead of action, even though he is the most capable being in the history of the universe to actually do action here. He just says, "I'll be praying for you." Now, this verse is pivotal in some of the excuses, which is what we're going to cover with the rest of part 2 here, that certain apologists give for why Satan is still around. Another inaction of God is 2 Corinthians 12:7. In fact, it is actual action of God that is in direct opposition with what his inaction should have looked like. Paul, who might be getting a big head despite everything he has said about boasting, recognizes that God himself has sent Satan, the messenger, as a thorn in his side to keep him from being too cocky. So simply because you might commit a sin, God will send Satan himself to cause some physical or spiritual torment to you, just to keep you subdued, to make sure you don't get too high on all the revelation of Christ that's going on. This is straight from Paul's mouth. This is not me guessing at this stuff. And the last verse I'll do is, again, going back to Revelation 21 through 3, where we have Satan, or the great dragon, the serpent, the devil, all of the different things that are alluded to here, is chained in a bottomless pit for 1,000 years. So that what? So that he will not continue to deceive the nations, is what is said. But after 1,000 years, he must, is the word, must be released for a little bit. So the one time that God actually does something about this creature, it only lasts for 1,000 years. It's to stop the deceit that has been going on for, who knows, this could be 10 billion years in the future. It could be tomorrow, biblically speaking. How many souls have to end up in hell or annihilation or whatever you want to say before God says, you know what, I think it's time we bring about that 1,000 years. I think this is the tipping point of how much deceit I want brought into my world that I am in complete control of with my all-powerfulness. Every second that God waits to destroy this enemy is another nick of injustice for this perfect being. Every single soul that dies and is bound to hell forever, while Satan roams the earth trying to devour people with deceit and confusion, is simply another example of God's evil. Because if you can stop that from happening to even one person, especially when you say that's what you desire and you don't, you're not only complicit, you're responsible. There is simply no getting around it. And yet, many will try. In fact, I've written down 5 of the main responses I think Christians try to give for this. I'd like to state them and then tell you why I don't think they hold up. Let's start with free will, the most ironic of the defenses. Well, if we didn't have this opposition to God, bringing in the chance for sin, bringing in temptation, bringing in the opportunity to go astray, then we're all robots for God. This is the greatest black or white fallacy, while at the same time actually doing the very thing it says it's trying to avoid. By having an actor in the world who can control minds, who can infiltrate spirits, who can lie, who can get in your head and convince you that a certain thing is true, even when it is untrue, that a certain thing is from God himself, even when it's actually from the enemy himself. This is inexcusable and a complete lack of free will. Think about what this being is, Lucifer, Satan, the devil, someone who was created way before humans. Who knows how many eons of knowledge and power Lucifer had while still in the heavenly host. His intellect, his powers versus some 15-year-old boy who's, by the way, past the age of accountability, some 30-year-old woman, some 80-year-old couple who makes the wrong choice. Are any of these a match for the father of lies? Think about how weak and feeble and immature and impossibly outmatched any human would be against this actual force. That very being acting in this world with the shape of our limited mortal minds and souls is a direct refutation of free will. It is adding in a player that robs free will. And your excuse for why that player is allowed is also free will? No. You can't do this. It doesn't make any sense. And by the way, I completely understand that some level of required resistance builds character. Great. And we've all heard analogies like this, but seriously, if I put a serial murderer genius in a cage with my 2-year-old, I have assured an outcome, right? My 2-year-old has no chance. It's too much. It can't build his character. It's not going to help in any sense of the imagination. There's nothing that is going to happen here that is going to end up being productive. It is going to be a net loss. And obviously, the second one soul that God says he desires is not lost, gets lost because of this little game, this little test, this opportunity for free will, you've already lost. And then look at the billions that, if this story were true, are burning in hell right now, and tell me this makes any sense. The second excuse, an even bigger cop-out, I think, is that of God's sovereignty. God can do whatever he wants, and God has a plan that he wants to fulfill where he's utilizing Satan as an agent, like we see in the Old Testament, and you don't have to like it, but at the end, God will defeat him. God will finally defeat evil. This is the story. This is for his glory. And if it's the way God wants to do it, then by golly, you better get on board. And this to me is simply what Christians have to tell themselves to be able to be okay with the obvious issue that this is when they can't reason it away with something like free will. When all other excuses fail, you turn to God's sovereignty. You return to his mystery. But it's so clear that this is an unnecessary level of harm as a byproduct just to achieve this end victory. God is supposedly all-powerful. evil, correct? So there has to then be another way that God could achieve this same outcome with less harm as a byproduct. If there's not another way, God's not all powerful. And the very fact that the number is so alarmingly high, there is so much confusion, so much falling away, so much deceit, so many unbelievers, so many people who are Christian, who at least think they're Christian according to the word, only to be spit out of the mouth of Jesus later when he says, I never knew you. That's going to be because they were deceived. They thought they had it right and they didn't. That's not fair. That's not some great grand plan. That's bad planning. That's collateral damage to an unacceptable level. And no excuse of sovereign God is going to fix that. One of the things I wanted to do for each of these, by the way, was an analogy, because analogies are what bring it home for me. That's what really helps me understand how ridiculous some of these concepts are. Imagine a CEO, this will be God, and he sees that one of his top people is embezzling money. Now, what should the CEO do right then and there? If you're honest, you would say he should address it. He should fire and or go after legally the embezzler, because the individual embezzler, not everyone else, needs to be punished. That punishment can be a lesson to others, and it will be protecting all the others who work at that company by keeping that company afloat, by keeping it healthy, therefore ensuring the potential growth, comfort, and security of all the other workers. But what if instead the CEO never ever addressed it, never told anyone about it, never fired the embezzler because he had some great grand plan that millennia later, or if we're sticking in the realm of the possible, that 80 years from now, he was going to reveal this embezzler and they were going to finally get their justice. Now, in the meantime, sure, were there hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of employees at this huge company that lost their job because there wasn't enough trust in the company and the public stock market because of these unexplained things that were going on financially. They had to do all of these layoffs. They couldn't focus on developing a better product or process that they were selling. It was all about covering this up, always dealing with this, the threat of this happening on a daily basis. It took over the entire scope of the company. Would that be a good CEO, or would you say that CEO could have and should have done better? But let's move on to the third one, which is similar to the first two. It's moral and spiritual growth. You need an enemy. You need to be able to be tempted and even give in and lose to recognize what a sinner you are, how weak you are as a person, and only in that understanding can you properly grovel, can you properly see your place as a creature of the dirt who needs a savior. Then you can start to be morally perfected. Is it impossible to gain this knowledge in the world that we have, even with suffering, even with sin, without having this other enemy force? Like, again, maybe I should back up this black or white fallacy that without Satan, everything could be perfect. It doesn't have to be. If God still wants there to be trial and tribulation, he can cause that. Do your own dirty work, God. But at least then we would know, supposedly, if this God is actually good, that every single thing he is doing for us, to bring us closer and to save the individual. When it's handed over to the devil, who has full dominion over the earth, the admittance there is that there's going to be casualties. There's going to be losses. This is just what has to happen for free will or God's sovereignty or moral or spiritual improvement to work out. Sorry, tough. It's a very limited mindset, not one we would expect from an omniscient or omnipotent God, and not one that we would rightly justify for anything else ever in history, yet alone the God of all creation. The analogy I give here is a very dumb teacher. Imagine if you showed up as a parent to parent-teacher conferences and you wanted to pick a bone with the teacher because your child has come home crying every single day. Every day, the child is harassed by this teacher. Every day, they are put down. They are called names. They are punished. They are struck. They are embarrassed. They are isolated. They are anything negative in the world that could ever even bring about a positive return. The idea from this teacher is, if we don't beat, starve, ridicule, and criticize these children, how will they learn? How will they improve? Would you keep your child there? Would you aim to have the teacher fired? Would you question the ethics and the strategy of the school, the superintendent, the principal, etc.? Of course you would. But when God seemingly does this, you say, what? Oh, he knows best? Oh, this is a good plan. That's totally justifiable, because somewhere out there, there's someone that's morally improving. Someone has a chance because of all of this to gain spiritual insight they otherwise wouldn't have had. Would you expect that teacher, by the way, to be aware enough smart enough, psychologically sound enough to utilize some positive reinforcement at least? Is there no beneficial way of morally improving someone? I've been in management for a long time, and one of the simplest things I've ever learned is not to try to catch people doing things wrong, but to try to catch people doing things right. You catch someone doing something wrong and you shame them for it, even if it's to try to help them grow from it. Yes, it might stick. Yes, you might actually get a desired outcome the next time, but you're not changing a core behavior. But if you catch someone doing something right, what they naturally were doing without you having to always have a carrot and a stick, and you recognize that, to build around that, you're going to get way better performance from a way better individual. I can recognize this with a few decades under my belt and a couple good management books, but the God of all creation can't see anything other than carrot and stick, beat them when they're down, introduce the worst possible thing into the world to create the most possible harm ever with the excuse of moral improvement. Demand more from your God. The next excuse is, Brandon, you're wrong. God will punish Satan. It's just deferred, as if this fixes everything else we just talked about. All it does is highlight it. Just because you think God's going to win in the end, because Satan will finally be destroyed. If you really believe that, first of all, I'd encourage you to watch this video. In this video, I show that if even one person is burning in hell forever, that God, as the person who created all of this, who didn't have to, who was under no requirements, who did so only for his own glory, that if he's serious about desiring none to be lost and even one is lost, God lost. Evil won. We know how many people have been alive on this earth. We know that the count is an insane number of billions and billions and billions of people burning in hell forever. And so the idea of deferred or prolonged punishment becomes ridiculous. The analogy here is simple. How about, let's go back to a serial killer who gets caught. It is clear what they have done. We know there's already been 28 people who have had their lives robbed, but we have finally caught him. And whatever your sense of justice is, at least now we can stop the next person from becoming a victim, right? That should be the end goal here. But what if instead the judge says, hey, we've identified who did what, and yes, it was wrong, but with all the wisdom that I have, my decision is to let this serial killer back into society. But don't worry, I'm only going to do it for like 50 years. Then we're going to bring him in and we're going to give him the worst punishment he's ever had. Do you think anyone would stand up in that courtroom and clap? Do you think anyone would say, look at this? What an amazing idea. What justice. What fairness. What a victory. No, of course not. And neither is this idea of God's great victory over evil in the end. If it's in the end, it means it wasn't in the middle and it wasn't in the beginning. And everything that has happened in between becomes completely inexcusable. The last one, and maybe the most pathetic of the excuses that I've heard in reference to this, is God does it to test one's faith. There's nothing more important than faith. And for faith to be real, it has to be challenged. It has to be tested. And even if this were true, to an extent, the way that this is acted out, if this is how we're using it as an excuse, come on. If you were in a relationship with someone, I'm jumping straight to the analogy here, and you've told them you've loved them, and maybe the two of you have even been through some hard things. You've been through some personality differences. Maybe you lost someone close to you and you had to deal with that together. Maybe there's been some hurt from between each other. You've already had to go through many things and also many positive things that brought the two of you closer. But one person in this relationship continues for the entirety of the relationship. There's never a reached end to put the other person through trials and tests just to make sure that they're loved. You know, like beat them just to see if they'll stick around. I'm just testing your love for me. By the way, this is exactly what God did with Job. So if when I said that a second ago, you thought, ugh, and now you're trying to make an excuse for God who just clearly did that in Job, I think you have some cognitive dissonance you should work out. And I'm not trying to be a jerk because I made these excuses forever myself. But when I put God even at a human level to see how much he fails, then you give him back his properties of perfection, love, justice, peace, light, all powerful, all knowing, foreknowing. No. It doesn't work. Again, if this person over and over and over physically, spiritually, psychologically, and emotionally abused the other person in the name of testing their love for them, we would consider this person to be evil. So help me understand what excuse other than these 5 there is for the simplest question that most people ask sometime in their childhood. If Satan is bad and evil and has power to hurt us or to even separate us from God, why does God allow it? I got to a point in my life where I couldn't, and it was just one of many issues that made it very clear to me that even if this God were real, I simply could not consider him good or worthy of worship. So also know that I say none of this to say this proves God isn't real. No, it doesn't. God could be evil. God could be bad. God could be inept. God could be confused. God could be stupid. God could be careless. God could be apathetic. God could be a billion things and still exist. But would it be a good God then? Would it be a God I should love, respect, obey, fear, and worship? I don't think so. It doesn't disprove God. It just disproves the unity of the Bible, the consistency of the Bible, the love of this God, the justice of this God, the very nature of this God as he is self-reported even. And for that, I think it is a major issue. So thanks for being here. Please let me know your thoughts on this one. I will see you Tuesday with another takedown. And until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Boris, GVI, Jacob, Joe, Kit Boga, Martin, Oliver, Perry, Rocket, and Sean, my Humanist Heroes, Imposter, James, Jared, and Christy, my Atheist Advocates, Caleb, Jeff, Jeffrey, Karen, Maggie, Paul, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of the channel or you just enjoy the content, please consider joining these fine people.